grant, and I feel actually really rather embarrassed about such a distinguished audience, not helped by the fact someone who walked past me, I won't name, looked at me and said, "What are you doing here?" No, it was. I've been invited, I think, because I'm one of the relatively few people from that early era who stayed in Bones and made a life in Bones. And while many of you may not know who I am, a lot of the people who did Bones will know about my work and my complete and absolute commitment to that. I'm currently actually not working in Bones often, and I'm a Dean of Students at the University of East Anglia. And privately, I could tell you about how an interest in dead people morphed wonderfully into an interest in live people. But that's another theme. Okay, so this is my personal history in relation to this topic. I came to Newnham in 1965, and I suspect that I had significantly more experience of excavation than the average archaeologist student then. I started digging when I was 15 with David Phillipson, who you'll remember as the fairly recently retired curator of the museum, and then through his recommendation moved on to work with Barry Cunliffe. And I worked on all sorts of excavations. The first one was Bath End Clump, which was a Neolithic site on the golf course in Moor Park next to the school that David Phillipson had been at. And then I worked at Fishbourne, Roman Villa, Porchester Castle, Eldon Sea, lots of Bedford sites, and Danebury as well. But that was afterwards. So I already had a lot of involvement with archaeology, and I think my first, in a sense, Higgsian influence was second-hand, because both Barry Cunliffe and David Phillipson had been at Cambridge earlier, a few years earlier, and had studied with Higgs. And in fact, it's probably quite an unknown fact that David Phillipson wrote the bone report of this small site called Eldon Seat very early on. And actually, it's a really, really good bone report. It really does start to show move from that zoological veterinary approach to animal bones and starts showing us how you can use bones to find out about human behaviour. So I think that was David Phillipson's rather brief foray into bones, but of course, and actually Barry could always pick up a bone and identify it too. So my first sort of Higgsian influence was second-hand. Then when I came here and did both part 1 and part 2, my memory is nothing like as good as yours, Tony. I cannot possibly remember. I remember only one essay, and that was for Colin Renfrew that I wrote. But I spent time in the bones room. I think one of the nice things about Cambridge archaeology at the time is that we did have kind of hands-on experience, and the museum then, in its wonderfully old-fashioned way, we read about a culture and then we saw the objects and we handled them, and that was really good. So we saw bones and we handled them. So I spent a lot of time in the bone room, and I increasingly spent more time than others because I began to develop a real interest in bones and what they could say. And of course, I've handled them through excavation and being curious. Now, I have to say, and I'm being very honest here, it actually wasn't a very comfortable place for a small woman from a college that produced very few archaeologists who was interested not in the Paleolithic, but in Neolithic and Bronze, and actually in my case, particularly Iron Age. And there very definitely was a culture of them and us. And these eminent people, some of whom we see before, were there, and I kind of found my path round the edges. But what I would always say was Eric was always kind to me, and of course Don, the fantastic technician, whose name I don't even remember. And he was just magic. He was so kind, helped so much. I learned so much from him and his patient teaching us. And it was actually, I diverted a little bit. When we went to do our revision session before the practical exam, he'd say, I looked very closely in that drawer if I read. So, but actually, I think I absorbed a lot of things from peripherally. There were these wonderful, exciting, clever people who were involved in Higgs's early agricultural project, and lots of ideas were bouncing about. So I kind of kept my ears open and didn't bother anybody and absorbed it all from outside. And I think one of the difficulties, I think, and Pamela's particularly asked me to talk about what it was like being a woman in Cambridge at that time, was that, of course, all colleges were single sex. So there were very few of us. The ratio of women to men was 1 to 10. And Newnham had no archaeological fellows. So the director of studies, in fact, was an Orientalist. And we were just farmed out here, there and everywhere. The disadvantage is that nobody owned us, nobody looked after us. But I had just the most wonderful people. You know, I had everybody who was important in Cambridge supervise me for at least a term. And one of those people, of course, was Eric. And I remember going to Panton Street house. Actually, at that time, I remember being in a room, I was just talking to Helen about it, in a room that had a bed in it. And I was nothing, I have to say absolutely nothing untoward was suggested, but I thought, oh, that's interesting. Anyway, so they were challenging supervisions, you always would question. It was a very privileged time. And I think another the reason that I had this slight peripheral, though, looking back on it, I owe so much to Eric and the ideas of the bone room, was because I heard the rumours about the excavations. I heard about, we didn't have that word boot camp in those days, but it was absolutely clear to me it was only masochists who could possibly want to go out to Greece because A, they were reported to be almost entirely men, there was supposed to be no food, very long hours, working in the heat, and you had to blooming pay for the privilege. And I thought, what kind of idiot is going to do that? And because I always went back and excavated in all my vacations and worked for people like Barry, and actually it was still run as a bit of a boot camp. That was part of his influence with Mortimer Reaver and military training. But you got lots of food and I got paid. So it seemed like a better deal to me. But okay, intellectually, what was the influence? Cambridge, it was a very, very interesting time to be in Cambridge, a very privileged time, and particularly if you were studying the, perhaps I should explain about the different cultures that existed. I think those of you who are undergraduates will not understand the sort of phenomenal cultural difference there was between those who studied the Palaeolithic, those who did NBI, Neolithic Bronze and Iron Age, and those that did, well actually even I was kind of thought people in later periods were definitely a bit on the suspects. But there were those very different cultures. And if you did NBI, carbon-14 had made the most fantastic change to thinking. It had changed the sequence of chronologies. There were no textbooks. You had to read journal articles. You had to look at site reports. I read bone reports. And so it was an enormous privilege to be introduced to the kind of research that most people don't do until they're doing PhDs when you're a first-year undergraduate, because it was the only way you could not write something that was so completely out of date. And of course, being with those people, and particularly for the Neolithic bit, being around those people who were looking at the early agriculture and all those changes, it was being lived in. The history of archaeology, the textbooks were actually being written around us and didn't exist. You certainly couldn't go to Wikipedia to get an overview of even put cultures in the right order. So that was a huge privilege to be there at that time, and it made one actually very independent. And secondly, of course, for me in my career, the influence of the bone ring. It showed me a path I wanted to go down. I wanted to do something that was different. I didn't want to study pots and flints. Everybody seemed to be doing pots and flints. And here were a group of people making meaning from bones, showing all those things which I've handled hundreds of in excavation, tell the really important stories about human history and the way humans relate to the environment, the way they structure their lives. I mean, Eric, I think Graeme just told me, what did you say that Graeme said about later periods? That it was just periphery or detail? Froth. But I was very interested in the froth. And that's where most of my career went. And in fact, looking at the development of my ideas, it did move away from the economic, the sort of Darwinism of some of Higgs's early ideas. And I became much more interested in the social and cultural role of animals in human societies, but one could not get away from that. It was profoundly influential, and I'm incredibly grateful for what that experience in the Boma, the vibrancy of that meant to me, and the enthusiasm that I got, and actually was able to continue doing it even in difficult circumstances. I'm just going to end actually with my last memory of Higgs. I went away from Cambridge after I graduated, but came back 10 months later, and by which time I was pregnant with my first child, and I bumped into Eric. It must have been probably 72, possibly thereabouts, with my small child in a pushchair. And he said, "Oh, come back, come have a cup of tea." And I went back, and Helen made me a cup of tea, and your children were around, and he was very, very warm. And he said to me, "Oh, I've just read something you've published, Annie. I'm going to use it as a basis of an article." And I don't know to this day whether he was going to completely and utterly rubbish it, or whether he was actually going to move on from it. And actually, I never really wanted to know. And it's a huge privilege to be here. And thank you, Eric, and thank you for those people that were so important in my whole trajectory.